They emerged from the peat bog like some grotesque man-made flora, two yellow loggers' boots, perfectly upright. At first, the two university students documenting soil strata in Minnesota's Superior National Forest took it for a macabre prank, a discarded mannequin perhaps. But the boots were laced tight. They were attached to legs, buried headfirst in the acidic earth in a formation that defied any natural explanation. This was not an accident. It was an arrangement. When the authorities arrived, the scene told a story not of a simple burial, but of a bizarre, vertical interment. At that moment, the case of Samuel Keene, the man who vanished from a Wisconsin mental health facility 24 years prior, was violently reopened. Before the institution, before the escape, there was a life. November 11th, 1998. Samuel Keene was a logger, a man whose hands were calloused from his work, but gentle with his family. The morning air in their small Wisconsin home smelled of pine resin and brewing coffee. He had a wife, Sarah, whose laugh could cut through the greyest winter day, and a 6-year-old son, Leo, who believed his father could fell any tree in the forest. They were a small, self-contained world built on modest plans and the predictable rhythm of the seasons. Their plans were simple: a new clutch for the old Ford pickup, a real vacation next summer, maybe to see the ocean Leo had only ever seen in books. These were the small dreams that buffered them against a life that was often hard. Money was tight. Samuel's father had co-signed a loan to help them through a lean season, a fact that sometimes surfaced in hushed conversations late at night. Samuel had once overheard his father on the phone, his voice strained, talking about needing more time, about a man from town who was not known for his patience. But that evening, any anxieties were buried under the warmth of the dinner table. Leo recounted his day at school with an exaggerated flair that made his parents exchange a knowing smile. Later, Samuel read him a story, the boy's head resting heavy against his chest. It was a scene of profound and unremarkable peace, the kind of moment that is never truly valued until it becomes a memory, sealed behind a wall of fire and ash. The house settled into the deep quiet of a northern night. Snow began to fall, muffling the world in a blanket of white. The last entry in Sarah Keene's daily planner, found fused by heat in the wreckage, was for the next day. It simply read, "Pick up birthday cake for Leo." At 2:14 a.m., the first emergency call was logged by the county dispatcher. When the volunteer fire department arrived, the Keene house was an inferno against the snow. From that inferno, only one person emerged: Samuel Keene, found hours later walking aimlessly down a logging road, his face blackened by soot, his words lost to smoke and shock. That was the moment the silence began. A final, complete severance from the world he had known. Sheriff Eva Rostova of the St. Louis County Cold Case Unit stood at the edge of the yellow tape, the damp, earthy smell of the bog filling the air. The scene was unlike any she had encountered in her 22 years of service. It was profoundly still, yet it screamed of a deliberate, calculated act. The initial task was grim and methodical, the slow, painstaking excavation of the upper torso and head. The team worked for hours, carefully removing layers of peat that had preserved the body in a near anaerobic state, effectively mummifying the tissue. The medical examiner's preliminary findings on site only deepened the mystery. There were no obvious signs of catastrophic trauma, no bullet wounds, no fractures consistent with the severe beating. The hyoid bone in the neck was intact, ruling out manual strangulation. It was as if the man had simply been placed there, placed, not thrown. And the positioning, the unnatural perpendicularity of the body, was the detail that lodged itself in the investigators' minds. It felt less like a burial and more like a planting. As the body was carefully raised, another team conducted a grid search of the surrounding woods. Half buried in the gnarled roots of a black spruce, less than 20 feet from the pit, a forensics technician found it, a weathered oilskin satchel. Its leather straps had rotted through, but the treated canvas had held. Inside, wrapped in a decomposing flannel shirt, were two spiral-bound notebooks. Their pages were warped and stained brown from the tannins in the soil, the ink in many places bleeding into illegible smudges. They were immediately sealed and sent to the forensics lab for painstaking restoration. Back at the morgue, toxicology reports would take weeks. But the initial autopsy confirmed the victim was a Caucasian male, approximately 6 feet 3 inches tall, consistent with the records of Samuel Keene. His hands were heavily calloused, the hands of a man who worked with tools, with wood. But the lack of a clear cause of death was the first major wall the investigation hit. How does a man die so peacefully that he can be arranged like a monument in the middle of a forest? This was not the work of a panicked killer hastily disposing of a body. The remoteness of the location, the sheer physical effort required for the burial, the bizarre staging, it all pointed to a single, chilling conclusion. This was an execution, planned and performed by someone who had time, strength, and an absolute lack of fear of being discovered. The first critical questions began to form on Rostova's whiteboard. Who had the knowledge of this specific terrain, far from any marked trail? Why bury a man this way, leaving his boots exposed to the sky as if they were a landmark? And most importantly, who was he running from, or running to, when he crossed from Wisconsin into Minnesota? The answers, Rostova suspected, were not in the soil around his grave, but locked in the faded ink of the two notebooks currently drying under the sterile lights of a laboratory. The investigation into Samuel Keene's disappearance in the winter of 1999 was, by any modern standard, a case study in institutional inertia. When he was discovered missing during a 4 a.m. bed check at the Northwood Behavioral Health Institute, the response was not one of urgent alarm, but of weary procedure. Keene was not just a patient. He was the hospital's most notorious resident, the man the local papers had unofficially condemned as the killer of his own family. In the eyes of the understaffed, underfunded facility, he was a problem that had just solved itself. A be on the lookout notice was issued to local law enforcement. It described Keene as 5'11", 190 pounds, with a history of psychotic episodes, and warned that he should not be approached. A perfunctory search of the immediate hospital grounds was conducted, turning up a single set of footprints leading into the dense woods before being swallowed by a fresh layer of snowfall. The search was called off after 6 hours. The official assumption was clear. Samuel Keene, ill-equipped and disoriented, had walked into the Wisconsin wilderness to succumb to the elements. This narrative was convenient for everyone. It closed a difficult case for the hospital administration. It removed a figure of local fear and pity from the community's conscience. The file on Samuel Keene was effectively closed within a week. The dominant voice in the internal reports from that time belonged to a senior orderly, a man named Arthur Finch, who was on duty the night of the escape. His notes described Keene as being particularly withdrawn in the preceding days, non-communicative and lost to his delusions. Finch's testimony cemented the official story. This was not a determined escape, but the final tragic wandering of a hopelessly broken mind. No one questioned why a man would flee a heated building in the dead of a sub-zero night, wearing only standard-issue pants, a thin shirt, and a pair of unlaced boots. No one investigated the possibility that he was not running from his demons, but from a person. The system that was meant to care for Samuel Keene had already written his final chapter. He was a man whose credibility had been incinerated along with his home. His silence in the face of questioning was interpreted as guilt, his trauma as psychosis. That collective decision to stop looking, to accept the easiest explanation, was not just negligence. It was a form of complicity. The wall of silence erected by the Northwood Institute in 1999 became the first layer of earth covering Samuel Keene's grave. It created a perfect void, a 24-year gap in which a hunter could track his prey, a killer could carry out a sentence, and a body could be planted like a secret in a forgotten corner of the woods, all without the slightest risk of being disturbed. While the lab worked to decipher Samuel Keen's waterlogged words, Sheriff Rostova's team began the arduous task of breathing life back into a 24-year-old file. They started with the human element, the former staff of the Northwood Institute. Most were now in their 70s and 80s, their memories of that time a collage of faded faces and institutional grey. They remembered Samuel Keen as a tragic figure, a ghost who haunted the halls long before he physically vanished. When asked about the staff, one name surfaced repeatedly, often after a thoughtful pause: Arthur Finch. A retired nurse, interviewed in her tidy suburban home, described Finch not as a monster, but as a presence. He was orderly, she said, the word carrying a double meaning. Everything had its place. Everyone had their place. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He had a way of looking at you, a stillness. It was the kind of quiet you didn't want to disturb. Others echoed this sentiment. Finch was remembered as efficient, controlling, and utterly dominant on the night shift, a man who commanded respect, born more from fear than admiration. None could recall a single specific incident of malice, only a pervasive sense of unease he projected. Simultaneously, investigators plunged into the hospital's physical archives, a basement room that smelled of dust and decaying paper. Keen's medical file was thick, documenting a regimen of powerful antipsychotics and sedatives. The notes, many penned by Finch himself, painted a portrait of a non-verbal patient lost in a catatonic state. It was a perfect paper trail, validating the theory of a man wandering aimlessly to his death. Finch's own personnel file was pristine, decades of service with no official complaints. The work was tedious, a slow sift through requisitions, maintenance logs, and staff schedules. They found that Arthur Finch had requested, and was granted, 2 weeks of personal leave starting the day after Samuel Keen was reported missing. The reason cited was family matters. It was a small flag, but in a cold case, small flags are all you have. For days, the search yielded nothing more, just the mundane administrative life of a forgotten institution. Then, a detective working through a stack of surplus inventory logs from the late 1990s found an anomaly. The hospital had a cache of old civil defense equipment in storage, including several heavy-duty tools. One item on the list was a specialized manual auger, a tool designed for boring deep, narrow holes for fence posts or geological surveys. The entry was logged in a tidy, almost severe handwriting. It noted that the auger was signed out for the purpose of grounds maintenance. It was a minor detail, a piece of equipment that could have been used for any number of legitimate tasks. And yet, there was no corresponding work order for any new fencing or deep planting on the hospital grounds that winter. The log showed it was signed out on the morning of February 3rd, 1999, by orderly Arthur Finch. The line for its return date was blank. The sheer strangeness of the burial site, its ritualistic, almost ceremonial nature, led investigators down an alluring but ultimately incorrect path. Archival police records from the late 1990s detailed the activities of a small, reclusive survivalist group active in that part of the Superior National Forest. Known as the Sons of Vidar, they practiced a blend of Norse paganism and extreme wilderness ideology. They were known for creating strange landmarkings and had a philosophy centered on returning impure elements to the earth to be cleansed. The vertical burial of Samuel Keen seemed to fit their esoteric worldview perfectly. For 3 weeks, this became the primary theory of the case. It felt right. It explained the unexplainable staging of the body and provided a pool of potential suspects. Sheriff Rostova's team dedicated hundreds of man-hours to tracking down the group's former members, now middle-aged men scattered across the country, living conventional lives. They were accountants, mechanics, and software developers who had long since abandoned their youthful ideologies. While most were cooperative, A few were defensive and resentful of the past being dragged into the light, a behavior that initially registered as suspicion. The investigation focused on the group's former leader, a man now living quietly in Oregon. He had the skills, the knowledge of the area, and the fervent belief system that made him a plausible suspect. Detectives were dispatched, and the man was interviewed for hours. He admitted to their strange rituals, but denied any knowledge of a killing, and his alibi for the winter of 1999 appeared solid. The case against the sons of Vidar was circumstantial, built on a compelling narrative, but lacking a single piece of hard evidence. Then, an email arrived from the state crime lab. The toxicology report on Samuel Keene's remains was complete. His system contained massive, incapacitating levels of phenobarbital. This was not a drug of the wilderness, not something a survivalist commune would have access to. It was a powerful, controlled barbiturate, an anticonvulsant and sedative commonly used in institutional settings in the 1990s. It was, in fact, one of the primary medications listed in Samuel Keene's medical file from the Northwood Institute. In that single clinical fact, the entire survivalist theory dissolved. This was not a ritualistic murder committed by believers in the forest. The presence of the drug meant the killer had control, that Samuel was likely sedated and compliant when he was led to his grave. The sons of Vidar were not killers, they were a distraction. The investigation, which had been focused on the rituals of the forest, was forced to turn 180 degrees and look back at the sterile, controlled world Samuel Keene had escaped from. The breakthrough did not come from a witness interview or an archived document, but from the ghost of Samuel Keene himself. The forensics lab, after weeks of painstaking work using multispectral imaging, had managed to recover 80% of the text from the waterlogged notebooks. The early entries were a harrowing chronicle of survival, the gnawing hunger, the brutal cold, the terror of being hunted. But it was a single repeated phrase that changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. In 3 separate entries, Samuel wrote about the finch, describing it as a relentless presence watching him from the trees. Investigators had initially dismissed it as the fragmented observation of a man losing his grip on reality. But Sheriff Rostova fixated on a line from the last legible page, written in a shaky but coherent hand. "The finch is here. It has eyes like my father's empty wallet." The phrase was too specific, too poetic, too laden with personal meaning to be random. It was a connection. Rostova's mind raced back to the hospital staff roster and the name of the senior orderly who commanded the ward with unnerving quiet: Arthur Finch. The empty wallet was not a metaphor for color, it was a metaphor for debt. As if on cue, a call came through to the sheriff's office. A woman in northern Wisconsin had been following the news of the case. Her recently deceased grandfather, Silas Blackwood, had owned a remote hunting cabin in Minnesota, not far from where the body was found. While cleaning out his effects, she and her family had found his old financial ledgers. They were mostly filled with mundane entries, but one recurring item caught her attention. She read the entry over the phone to Rostova. The ledgers, once in police possession, were irrefutable. Starting in March of 1999 and continuing every month for 23 years, was a record of a cash payment for $200 from A. Finch. The payments were consistent, methodical, and without any stated purpose. They were the price of silence. The final entry, dated May of 2022, just after Silas Blackwood's terminal diagnosis, was different. Next to the final payment, Blackwood had written in a trembling script, "Debt paid in full. May God forgive us both." Suddenly, all the disparate pieces snapped into a single terrifying picture. The fire that killed Samuel's family was not his fault. It was arson, started by a local loan shark named Arthur Finch to intimidate Samuel's father over a debt. The fire got out of control, and Finch, using his position at the Institute, ensured the traumatized, incoherent sole survivor was medicated into a silent scapegoat. When Samuel escaped, Finch couldn't risk the truth ever surfacing. He hunted him down, using the phenobarbital from the hospital to sedate him, paying Silas Blackwood to act as a jailer in the wilderness. The auger wasn't for hospital grounds, it was for a grave. The entire mystery was not about a man who got lost. It was about a monster who, for over 2 decades, had been meticulously burying a single, terrible secret. Based on the evidence from the diaries, the ledgers, and Arthur Finch's eventual confession, the final weeks of Samuel Keen's life can be reconstructed with chilling clarity. It happened like this. After his escape, Samuel journeyed north, driven by a primal instinct to return to the wilderness he knew. He was not aimless. He was surviving, building shelters, foraging, his mind slowly clearing from the fog of medication. He found the old, unused hunting cabin belonging to Silas Blackwood and took refuge there, a ghost in the deep woods. But Arthur Finch was not a man to leave a loose end. He knew that if Samuel's memory returned, his own life would be forfeit. Using his leave from the hospital, he began a methodical search, treating it not as a manhunt, but as a form of pest control. He tracked Samuel to Blackwood's property. He didn't confront him immediately. Instead, he first confronted Silas Blackwood, offering him a deal, a steady stream of cash in exchange for 2 things, his silence and information on the squatters' movements. Blackwood, isolated and in need of money, agreed. The end came on a bitterly cold afternoon. Finch approached the cabin not as a threat, but as a savior, carrying a thermos of hot soup. He spoke to Samuel in the same calm, authoritative tone he used at the Institute. He offered help, a way out of the cold. For Samuel, starved and isolated, the offer was a lifeline. He accepted the food, not knowing it was heavily laced with the phenobarbital Finch had stolen from the hospital's dispensary. The drug's effect was swift and incapacitating. The world would have softened at the edges, the forest tilting as a leaden weakness spread through his limbs. His will to fight, to run, was not broken by violence, but chemically dismantled. He was conscious, but a prisoner in his own body, forced to watch as Finch dragged him on a sled toward a pre-selected location in the peat bog, a spot where Finch had already used the stolen auger to bore a deep, narrow hole in the earth. There, by the edge of the pit, Finch explained his logic with the cold detachment of a man settling a debt. Samuel was not a person. He was a liability, a bad seed that could one day sprout the truth of the fire and ruin him. Therefore, he had to be planted where nothing could ever grow. Samuel's world then inverted as Finch, a man of surprising strength, forced him headfirst into the shaft. The last thing he would have seen was not the winter sky, but the dark, fibrous walls of the earth closing in around him. The last sensation was the cold pressure as Finch packed the peat and soil around his body, tamping it down until only his legs, from the knee down, remained visible. He left the yellow boots exposed, not as a mistake, but as a statement. A grotesque, private monument to a secret he believed was buried forever. With the task complete, he returned to his life, a respected community member, making the first of 276 monthly payments to Silas Blackwood to guarantee the silence of the woods. Sheriff Eva Rostova found Arthur Finch tending to his rose bushes in the manicured garden of his modest suburban home. He was a 75-year-old man, a portrait of quiet retirement. Rostova didn't raise her voice. She simply laid out the evidence on the hood of her patrol car, a high-resolution photograph of the diary entry with its mention of a wallet, and a copy of Silas Blackwood's ledger. For a long time, Finch said nothing, his face a placid mask. Then, as the body cam on Rostova's uniform recorded, the mask cracked. Not with a torrent of grief or remorse, but with a chilling, self-serving logic. His confession was a monologue of justification. He spoke of the fire as an unfortunate business expense, of Samuel Keen as a loose thread that had to be snipped. He was a problem, Finch stated, his voice steady, almost conversational. I simply provided a permanent solution. It was a matter of administration. The words, captured in crystal-clear audio, were a testament to a conscience that had not been burdened by guilt, but only by the inconvenience of a long-held secret. He was arrested without incident, his hands, which had once tended his prize-winning roses, placed in cuffs. The legal process was cut short. Arthur Finch died of a heart attack in his cell 3 months after his arrest while awaiting trial. Justice, in the theatrical sense of a courtroom showdown, would never come. For Silas Blackwood, already deceased, justice took the form of a tarnished legacy, his name forever linked to the conspiracy in local memory. The news of Finch's crimes sent a shockwave through the small Wisconsin town that had known him as a benign community figure, a quiet man who kept to himself. For Samuel Keene, the resolution came in a different form. The discovery of the diaries and Finch's confession officially exonerated him in the 1998 house fire that had killed his family. He was no longer a suspect, but a victim, a fact formally entered into the public record. The story reached a distant cousin of Samuel's, a woman who had only vague childhood memories of him. For her, the news was not about vengeance, but about reclaiming a piece of her family's history from a lie that had stood for over 2 decades. The file on Arthur Finch was closed. The legal questions were answered. But the resolution felt hollow, an echo across a chasm of lost years. Justice had been rendered, but it was a cold, procedural act. It could amend a legal document and expose a killer, but it could not restore a life, a family, or the 24 years that Samuel Keene spent first as a patient, then a fugitive, and finally as a silent monument in a forgotten bog. Today, the spot in the Superior National Forest where Samuel Keene was found is unremarkable. The pit has been filled, the ground seeded, the yellow police tape long since removed. Nature, with its slow, indifferent patience, is reclaiming the clearing. To an unknowing hiker, it is just another patch of wilderness, quiet and serene. But for those who know the story, the silence here is different. It is not the peaceful silence of the woods. It is the heavy, weighted silence that follows a long overdue confession. The yellow boots, after their journey through the evidence locker, were never placed behind the glass of a museum exhibit. Samuel's cousin, his last living relative, claimed them. In a small churchyard in Wisconsin, she buried the empty boots beneath a simple granite headstone. It bears his name, the dates of his life, and a single crucial line: innocent. It is a final, quiet correction to the official record. In the towns bordering the forest, the official story has faded into local legend, a ghost story told around campfires about the strange discovery of the man in the yellow boots. Samuel Keene's tragedy was twofold. Arthur Finch took his life, but it was the system that first took his voice. The diagnosis of psychosis provided a convenient and comfortable narrative, one that required no further questions. It was easier to label a traumatized man as a monster than to hunt for the real one hiding in plain sight. His truth, penned in a shaky hand in a cheap notebook, was a message in a bottle, cast not into the sea, but into the cold, preserving earth. The legal files are now closed. The perpetrator is dead. The truth has been officially documented and archived, but the case of Samuel Keene serves as a permanent, chilling reminder of the cost of not listening. The Northwood Institute demanded his silence in life. The earth kept it in death. It took 24 years for someone to finally read the words of the man everyone had written off, proving that some truths, no matter how deep you plant them, refuse to be buried forever.